Hello everyone, and welcome to another in the series of TCCA Critical Update webinars. Today's webinar is co-hosted with our friends and colleagues at British APCO. My name's Tony Gray, and I'm Chief Executive of TCCA, the global representative body for and advocate for open standards for the critical communications sector. This webinar is led by Professor David Allen of Leeds University Business School, who will be presenting the key findings and recommendations arising from recent research into the approaches being taken to critical broadband migration by the UK's fire and rescue services. We're grateful to also be joined today by Steve Watson, Deputy Director ESMCP from the UK Home Office, who will answer questions specific to the ESMCP programme and ESN, and also Ian Taylor of the National Fire Chiefs Council, will take questions relating to the fire and rescue services. Please submit your questions during the webinar using the questions pane on the right of your screen. If you're on a mobile phone, this appears at the bottom of the screen. If there's time immediately after David's presentation, Steve and Ian will answer as many questions as possible. If there are any that can't be addressed during the webinar, they'll be responded to afterwards, and we'll be circulating a document containing all the questions and answers after the event. We're delighted to have more than 250 people from around the world registered for this webinar. So now, on behalf of BAPCO and TCCA, it's my pleasure to welcome your presenter for today. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm delighted to be here to be able to talk about this piece of research with you. I'm going to start by, first of all, turning my webcam off because I'm working from a single laptop from home, as you can see, and if I leave the webcam over, all I can see is my own face. So this piece of research is undertaken in collaboration with colleagues from the Home Office, myself, and the research fellow that worked on it, Daniel Pugh. And our scope was to look at the ICT and the fire and rescue services in England, and specifically to focus on the preparedness for and responses to ESN. The approach was one which was a mixed methods approach, where we used both quantitative data collection via a survey and also qualitative data collection via interviews. We started back in 2018, designing the actual survey and the instruments we used, and basing these on both prior research, but also on schedules and interview schedules we developed already with other partners for work with the police service and other services. And data collection started in 2019. We view this as very much as a co-production, so we involved colleagues from the Fire and Rescue Service in the design and development of the question sets, and got significant input from the Home Office, which helped us tailor and focus the questions. So we used earlier research on police ICT infrastructure, which we'd developed over a number of years, and we'd run the survey as a national survey with the police services in the UK on three prior occasions. And we felt this gave it some degree of comparability. So we kept some of the questions the same, as you'll see in the results, in order to be able to compare between UK Fire and Rescue and UK Police. We actually piloted it with 2 fire and rescue services to ensure the wording of the questionnaires and choices of the technology were appropriate to the sector. The key aspects we looked at were, first of all, how our services delivering their IC infrastructure, how are they approaching the key challenges which they face, what are the key challenges they face, and then what we tried to do was look at the condition of the technology as well. And we looked at a range of different technology areas from areas of interest, from control infrastructure through to call handling, shared control infrastructure, remote working, partnering systems, IP communications. So the aim here was to be quite comprehensive and look at a whole range of technologies within these different work areas. We looked at the condition of technology, and this was a self-reported view of the condition of their different technologies. We wanted to understand the extent to which they saw and the services saw these technologies as being areas of significant change in the very near future, the near future being 3 to 5 years. We also wanted to look at how high a priority a technology was for development within fire and rescue services. And finally, what we wanted to do was understand the extent to which the services felt a particular technology or work area would change due to the implementation of ESN. Now, this was sent out to the chief officers of 44 services, contacted. We emailed them out, we phoned them, and we wrote to them with support from colleagues. And we got responses from 40 of 44 services. I have to say this was a slower process than we expected. It took us more time to get the data than we hoped to, but by the end we were quite pleased we got the majority of them. The qualitative interviews were semi-structured. What we did is looked at the quantitative responses and used these as ways of probing, the qualitative element as a way of probing areas of interest and areas of focus. And our aim here was to reach a more in-depth understanding of the technological infrastructure examined, so to go into more depth around this, to enrich the quantitative data set with additional information from Pacific Fire and Rescue Services, to discuss their readiness for ESN and perceptions of ESN, and then to look a bit more detail about the connections between different fire rescue services, the police services, other public sector agencies. And the aim here was to complement the quantitative results and add depth to the results. So I'd like to start by going through some of the quantitative findings in brief with you. So I think the first point to make is what we saw was a very heterogeneous fire and rescue service ICT infrastructure in the UK, with some very significant challenges which they face. As you can see here, right on the right-hand side with the table there, where we've got the areas of challenge, you're seeing some very significant areas in terms of legacy systems, management of legacy systems, where 52% of services saw that as an area of what's challenging or very challenging for them. When we talk about a heterogeneous fire and rescue service in terms of the ICT infrastructure, what we're talking about there is very different responses to the different questions in terms of the condition of their technology, their priorities, and their value of the technology. We think in part this may reflect the different positions in terms of the size of the organisation. So for those of you who are not from the UK, in the UK, if we look at some of the size of the fire and rescue services, 4 services in the UK have got over 900 firefighters, with some of them up to the largest one being London, with just over 4,500 firefighters. Whereas you look at some of the smaller fire services in the UK, that can go down to 245 Oxfordshire, and there's a large number of services in between the 900 and the 245 firefighter range. So you've got quite a difference there between the very large services and quite small ones as well. If we look at the areas of challenge again in a bit more detail, and if we look here, this is a comparison between police data and fire and rescue service data around the areas of challenge. Now, the fire and rescue, the police data was collected 3.5 years before late 2016, so 3 years before this data. So there's a degree of caution when doing a comparison. However, what we're seeing is the fire and rescue service seeing a number of the challenges which they find the police service see as less challenging in some services. So enterprise content management, ability to search information held, maintaining data in a secure manner while using IT more intensely, and ability to use analytics to gain insight from information held. So these are less challenging areas. However, what we're seeing also is an increased priority, a higher priority for some of these areas. So for example, information governance is a particularly almost 88% see it as a high priority. Ability to search, again, they don't see it as a challenging area, but they see it as a particularly important and a priority area for them. Maintaining data and information in a secure manner. Again, we're common with many organizations now as we move towards datafication. They're seeing it as a priority area as well. And again, ability to use analytics in gain insight is seen as an area of priority. When we look at the condition of the technology, what we can see again here is an issue or a concern around the condition of the technology. And only 2 technologies were identified as being up to date by at least 90% of the services. And that was automatic vehicle location for the management of resources, and automatic call distribution for the handling of calls that come in to the service. As we go down, what we're seeing is a varying level of technology being up to date, with, say, partnering systems only at just under 30% are saying that it's actually out of date. This finding is also reflected in the recent annual assessment of fire and rescue services in England, 2020, in which they stated that some services have been slow to exploit opportunities for productive ways of working presented by technology, and nearly half of the services we inspected were using broken, dated, or unreliable IT systems and had inefficient paper-based systems. Many computer systems that services rely on are slow and don't work together. So this perception that we found in our work or view here of an aging infrastructure which wasn't up to date was also reinforced by other more recent research. When we move on to areas of change and expected change, the areas identified by at least 75% of fire and rescue services as facing significant or transformational change were the ones which you've got in front of you here. And what we can see here is incident management, records management, surveillance, workforce management are all seen as key areas, as is remote working, particularly looking at in-vehicle mobile data. And to explain the table a bit more detail here, on the left-hand side, you've got the area of work activity. On the right-hand side, what you've got the specific technology used within that context. So when we look at surveillance, we're looking at person mounting counters or body-worn cameras. When looking at technology and technology development, what we saw is very much a focus on operational work and workforce performance as being the key areas that fire and rescue services are focused on as priority areas. So when we look at the areas where at least 80% of fire and rescue services focus on it, it's things like remote recording of data, data governance, in-vehicle mobile data terminals, encryption as being areas of key interest. But again here, what we'd be expecting perhaps if you saw a more homogeneous ICT infrastructure was more consensus here on the areas of priority. What we're seeing is only, for example, in the top 10, 64% are looking at location services, what means 36% aren't. Let's turn now to talk a little bit about the Emergency Services Mobile Communications Program and ESN. And I think it's clear that although some people were very enthusiastic, and we did get some very positive responses from particularly some of the larger fire and rescue services, on the whole, respondents were very skeptical about the benefits of ESN products to the fire and rescue service. And I think it's clear to say from our perspective, from our analysis of data, that the benefits and motivations to engage with the ESN products were seen at best as being ambiguous. And I think this is linked to the organizational culture in fire and rescue services, where there's very much a culture of getting things done, getting the job done, resolving problems, but also being risk averse. And as one of the respondents says in an interview, we're risk averse. We're conscious that if we take risks, people normally die. So we're not an industry that would wish to do anything leading edge in the fire ground. We prefer to use tried and tested and reliable technology that's been proven over time. What was surprising to us again was that only 5 areas were identified by 60% of services as areas of transformational change related to ESN. And this again for us was an indication of the heterogeneous nature of the services, and gives an indication also of not just their technology infrastructure, but as I'll talk about a little bit later on, about their governance and capability within the organizations. So if we look here, what we see here is some of the key areas there being partnering systems, fire and rescue incident management systems, control infrastructure, records management, and remote working being the ones where 60% of the services have got agreement that this could be affected by ESN in a significant manner. Again, this is two diagrams. So far, I've shown you average responses. I thought it'd be useful as well to show you some of the more specific and individual responses. So when we normally do research, we tend not to name the names of organizations, but in this piece of research, we had agreement from the participants to reveal for the quantitative element their names of the organizations. For the qualitative element, it was completely anonymized. So if we look at this quantitative data here, looking at the degree to which broadband access in vehicles will change due to ESN, we're seeing some services, some quite large services, saying that they see no change at all. We're also seeing some services saying that they don't know how it will change. And then you've got other services again pointing to minor change, the bulk pointing to either significant change or transformation. But you can see the spread here of responses and services. When we move to the communication with partners through data, now both of these areas we would expect very significant or transformative change from ESN, given the systems that most services are using at the moment. So I would have expected the bulk of the responses here to be around significant change or transformation. Here again, what we're seeing here is one service saying no change, quite a few pointing to don't know, and quite a few pointing again to minor change there again. So you've got a heterogeneous response, not a homogeneous response from the fire and rescue services. We link this very much to the governance of the fire and rescue services. When we analyzed the transcripts of the interviews, so when we interviewed people, what we did is we had the interviews, we then audio recorded them with permission, we transcribed the interviews, and then we coded and analyzed all of the interviews. What it pointed to was that the governance of the fire and rescue services has a significant influence on the capability of the services to engage with or implement complex and large-scale ICT projects while maintaining existing systems. So to do the two in parallel is problematic for these services. And for the people who are not from the UK, when we look at the UK fire and rescue services, some of them are unitary, some of them are part of a local council, some of them are governed by the police, fire and crime commissioners. So there's different models of governance in the UK for the different services. So one model is where the fire and rescue services is linked with a single local council, and they cover the same geographical area. They reported that they saw themselves as just a separate department within a local council. Their IT department was the IT department of the local authority. And critically, what they said is that it had the link person was just one person between the two organisations. So the person who was managing the relationship between the county council's IT and the fire and rescue services was one individual. So if we look on the right-hand side, this gives some indication of another reason why this is problematic. So this is problematic in terms of local authority budgets. Some local authorities in the UK have found a period of austerity particularly difficult and have cut ICT, have cut back office to spend on frontline services. And the fire and rescue services has pointed to this as a significant problem which has affected some of them, where the resource has not been available to develop technology in the local authority, resource in terms of capital expenditure or resource in terms of people to develop ICT. So it's significantly affected their ability to develop systems. Later on, I'm going to talk a little bit around ambiguity around ESN, understanding of ESN. And these local authorities, these fire and rescue services also pointed out the fact that they weren't quite clear about the business case at this point for ESN as being problematic in persuading already cash-strapped local authorities to spend more money to invest in terms of ESN. And this really wasn't CapEx or capital expenditure. It's more about operational expenditure and the support to develop it. Equally, I think it's important to stress here that when we look at any form of outsourcing relationship, what we know from existing research is that to manage a good or develop a good outsourcing relationship, you need individuals who are highly skilled within the client organization, who are employed fully by the client organization, who can then communicate with the vendor. Now, to make sure the relationship succeeds. Now, this again, as I'll come on in a second, was problematic in some of the smaller organizations. There are other ways of, as I said, governing fire and rescue services, and one emerging one is the use of police, fire and crime commissioners, which govern both the police service and the fire service. When talking to these services, they pointed to problems with this approach as well, where they talked about being, for example, a small fish in a big pond, where a small fire and rescue service was placed with a large police service in terms of numbers, and the needs of the police service in terms of ICT and support took priority over the fire and rescue service, or certainly a perception was there that was the case. Equally, they didn't see the economies of scale they expected by joining the two organizations together because of the particular security needs of police systems. The argument was put to us was that what was happening is that the systems were kept in parallel. So they maintained their parallel infrastructures without gaining the economies of scale by bringing them together. When we look at the ICT capability, I think this is an area which is problematic, and certainly in our findings, an area we recommend for further investment and development. So in undertaking the interviews, although the questionnaires went to the chief fire officer, they were then delegated down to the person responsible for ICT within each of the fire and rescue services. And then from that, we then interviewed the people who filled in the questionnaires. One response we got, which was quite a short interview from one fire and rescue service, was that they couldn't answer the questions. They'd sent the questionnaire set out to the local authority to fill in, and as the person dealing with that relationship, I'm not a techie, and we're just part of the county council, and they just form the IT strategy. So what we're seeing here is a lack of control over the ICT strategy and the ICT destiny of the local fire and rescue service, because they don't have the capability internally to manage that, and because they are in a client relationship with the local authority are forming IT strategy and making decisions around technology. When we look at development of systems and how we're collaborating to develop systems, what we see is a high reliance on in-house development still. So 48% said they got a high or very high reliance on in-house development. When we looked at this as well, what we saw as well was some also pointing to collaboration with other fire services. Although you're seeing that collaboration with the police service, the key areas of collaboration still to be fire and rescue services. And that can be seen, for example, of shared control centres, where 46% said they were in there, and only 5% said they were shared with the police. I'd like to make the point here in terms of collaboration around the fluidity and diversity of collaborative relationships and the negative impact of that on provision of ICT and ability to engage with any form of national system. What we're seeing and what's being reported to us is a fluidity in collaborative relationships, where the different services are negotiating either at the technology level, where they're moving towards common platforms together, or a political level where they're looking at organizational collaboration, and therefore technology collaboration, information collaboration follows that, or more strategic relationships where we see mergers or strategic alliances between services. All of these are perfectly legitimate approaches to collaboration. However, the fluidity was pointed to as creating uncertainty, and many of the respondents pointed to the fact that they felt that there was a situation where they were constantly moving goalposts and moving key infrastructures as they have to change their collaborative relationship. It's also clear that the collaborative relationships were not necessarily dependent upon geographical co-location. So let's move on a little bit to talk about preparedness and capacity to engage with ESN. So the first point is, again, that preparedness and capacity to engage were not based on geographical co-location. So you may have two services which are next to each other, which have different strategic alliances. They have different life cycles for their existing technology, their mobile technology, their comms technology, and are in different positions, therefore, to engage. Also, there may be different sizes and have different capabilities in-house in terms of technology as well. So you're also seeing key dependencies in terms of infrastructure between fire and rescue services that are not co-located. I think I really can't stress enough this issue of this fluidity and the fact that they're renegotiating collaborative agreements, abandoning existing agreements, or creating new relationships for delivery of core ICT. And this causes fluidity, it causes problems in terms of strategic planning for these organizations. It doesn't give them a solid base in which to move forward as a network, as a system, as a fire and rescue service for England, rather than individual fire and rescue services. So when we looked at understanding of ESN, we have to say, some of the respondents absolutely got it, saw that ESN can be transformative, saw the value of ESN, and looked at the existing infrastructure and technologies that they were using and could recognize the difference and capability. And some had planned forward to think about how this technology could help them transform the way in which they worked. But the majority of respondents indicated there's a lack of clarity about ESN was restricting innovation, particularly around suppliers, increasing costs, leading to inertia and inability to plan. And therefore, the service indicated that they would continue to develop and deploy services using commercial bearers on the assumption that they could just transition to ESN when it became available. Some of them were actually writing into contracts that the technology which they purchased would be ESN compliant. So the Fire and Rescue Service didn't know what ESN compliant meant, but they were then passing that burden then onto the suppliers. The concern from the ESN or the Fire and Rescue Services was that to be compliant, to state that, to manage that risk, that meant the cost of the services offered by the vendors had to increase. So their understanding of ESN, in terms of the case for data of ESN, beyond that provided to fire tenders, was very unclear to many respondents. A number of services did not know how communications with partner will change through the implementation of ESN. So they're looking at the fire tenders as the core place to get next generation network communications through. They're not looking at it in terms of partner change, particularly in terms of a number of services. Now, we found that quite surprising. Many of the capability offered by ESN Connect was already provided via commercial networks. And so there are potentialities there around, for example, providing to the fire tender as a point of information. I think there's colleagues here from France, and I know in France they're looking at that with particularly special forces, use of Wi-Fi or 5G bubbles around vehicles or individuals. And this was mentioned by a number of respondents in terms of the way in which they were developing and using existing technologies. So not 5G, but using commercial bearers. So only 60% of services indicated that broadband wireless access would, in vehicles, would change due to ESN. And they also noted the low condition of the existing systems. So we were surprised by these results. We expected a more positive response here. There are also concerns about voice and network coverage in rural areas and in buildings. And the argument was put that while ESN Assure will help understand coverage, it doesn't resolve issues related to costs and speed to which these can be resolved. And there was concern about running two services in parallel and paying for these two services and not having the coverage in the rural areas and not being unsure about who will pay for additional coverage in the rural areas. NATS testing was also put forward, and I think this has been resolved, or this issue has been resolved since the data has been collected. But the point that was put here is that a number of them had high reliance on cloud computing and use of existing apps, and they placed high priority on software as a service And they saw, therefore, the cost of NATS testing as individual for each service, for each application, as being prohibitive and causing problems, which will impact on their ability to engage with ESN. The ambiguity and potential cost of ESN to fire and rescue services also raised by most respondents. Now, I think, again, this point I'm making here has been superseded, but it was stated that, and the concern that was put forward was that because ESN had been delayed, they felt to be tied into devices and networks which had been superseded already and would rapidly become obsolescent. Many were already using 4G networks, and they said that they had devices with greater capability than the ESN Connect device. And it's important to point here that they had these commercial relationships in place already with 4G networks, and we're using these. Now, as you'll see in the report, we point to use, for example, of social media. So what we're seeing is them using these 4G networks to do things like Google Docs, Dropbox, WhatsApp, to share data. And obviously there's concerns around security of that sharing process. And as I said earlier, the concern was about the provision on some need to support ESN and manage airwave contracts in parallel. I'll conclude now by looking at briefly just some of our key recommendations from the research. I think a strong one from us was that the multiple government structures and various levels of capability and capacity, they seem to be very significant impediments to system-wide change. Now, I think this impacts on the ability to deliver ESN, but also will impact on any delivery of any national service. And I think there needs to be a strategic review of governance and collaboration between the services. And I think a strong consideration should be given to providing further resource for county or smaller unitary fire and rescue services to obtain internal technical support for delivery of ICT infrastructure. And we think that's absolutely key to moving forward, particularly the last point about additional resource there. So it's not as much CapEx, it's having the skill set, the knowledge, expertise available on tap to move forward and manage the vendor relationships so that they can be successful. I think the other point is that the heterogeneous nature of the ICT landscape in terms of ICT capacity, capability, and condition of infrastructure and the priorities indicates that what we need is a service-by-service support to bring people up to the same level, to bring people to common standards and approaches, and also identify common areas where common activities may be particularly helpful across sectors, across services. Although the Police and Crime Act places a statutory duty on fire and rescue, police services and ambulance trusts to collaborate, the fluidity and the diversity of their collaborative relationships is reported as leading to inefficiencies and will inevitably lead to less effective use of resource. And I think this is absolutely clear that this negatively influences delivery of the National Programme for ICT or any National Programme for ICT or approach to national infrastructure. And I think there's an opportunity here through the Police and Fire and Crime Commissioners to access resource. However, they need for the guidance to enable joint implementation and bringing together the underlying infrastructures, and to address this issue of security as being seen as the key barrier to this form of collaboration. Now, we're not here, I must be clear, stating we've no evidence to state that this approach is the Police and Fire Commission's any superior to any other, or we're pointing to make that work. They need further guidance and support there to make these operate efficiently. As I made earlier, point earlier that many of the fire and rescue services were using commercial bearers who provided data services to tenders. There's an assumption that, as I said, that this will continue. There's an assumption that the sorts of tools that we use as workarounds such as Dropbox, Zoom, whatever else, will continue, either in parallel through their own 4G networks or devices, or they'll just use ESN only via the tender, and for everything else they'll be using a 4G network. And we feel that that needs to be addressed and clarified. So in the briefing document and in the final report, you'll see a range of other recommendations and findings. But to conclude, to address the disparities in governance, we recommend that the Home Office review existing fire and rescue governance structures across England. Sorry, that shouldn't read Wales, that's England only. And to address the ICT infrastructure and capability and capacity challenges, we recommend further investment in skills and infrastructure to fully engage with ESN and any next generation networks offer. I think to finish off with, we're in an area of COVID that for all of us has pointed to the importance of secure, reliable networks. And it is, I guess, unsustainable that fire and rescue services in the UK, many of them are relying on older, antiquated technologies to manage some of their core processes. So we think the recommendations from this research perhaps need urgent review. I'd like to finish on that point and open for questions.
That brings us to the end of today's webinar. We hope everyone who's been with us has found it useful and informative. I'd like to thank once again very much David, Steve and Ian for their involvement and valuable responses to the questions. Please let us have your feedback afterwards, but for now, goodbye, and wherever you are in the world, stay safe and well.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.